Waitress helps a homeless man, exposed as the secret CEO. The shocking truth changes everything. Before we get into this story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you enjoy stories like these, be sure to subscribe. We post at the same time every day. Maria's shift was over an hour ago. So why was she still here, wiping the same spot on the counter for what felt like the 20th time? She couldn't shake the feeling that something about tonight was off. The diner was nearly empty, the neon lights outside casting flickering shadows on the checkered floor. In the corner booth, a man sat hunched over. He wore layers of tattered clothing, his hair disheveled and gray, eyes sunken as though he hadn't slept in days. But he didn't look like he belonged here or anywhere else. Maria glanced at the clock and then back at him. She couldn't recall seeing him come in, and that was the first red flag. In a place where customers usually shuffled and talking loudly, ordering coffee, or complaining about the weather, his silent presence was unnerving. Each time she looked over, he seemed to be staring off into space or was perhaps carefully observing everyone around him without making a sound. Instinct told her he wasn't dangerous. He looked more lost than anything else. Still, the manager, Steve, had a strict policy about loiterers, and that usually meant homeless folks got kicked out if they didn't order something. She felt a pang of guilt at the thought, because this man looked like he genuinely needed warmth and a place to rest. Maria's heart clutched when Steve emerged from the kitchen, frowning. She knew he'd spotted the man too. Steve was like a shark smelling blood, always on the lookout for people he considered a threat to the diner's image. Maria could almost hear the comment he was about to make. He hated homeless people lingering around, claiming they were bad for business. But the diner was nearly empty, and this man wasn't causing a scene. Still, she flinched at the knowledge that conflict was brewing, especially this late at night when everyone's patience was wearing thin. Steve approached Maria, ignoring the fact that she was clearly exhausted and long overdue to go home. Shift ended at 9. He barked in a low voice. What are you still doing here, and who's that? Maria tried to explain that she hadn't had the heart to kick out a man who looked like he might freeze if he had to go back outside. But Steve scowled, muttering something about freeloaders and no freebies. He marched over to the corner booth with heavy footsteps, causing the old man to look up. The old man's eyes flickered with a faint spark of awareness, as though he recognized Steve, but he said nothing. Maria followed, trying to intercept or at least soften the blow of Steve's harsh words. She offered a small, apologetic smile to the man, who gave a subtle nod of thanks. Steve wasted no time. Sir, he snapped. This is a business, not a shelter. You want to stay, you order something or get out. Maria's stomach dropped. The old man raised his gaze toward Steve with an almost regal calmness, which made Steve falter for just a moment. But as always, Steve steeled himself with that bully-like bravado. Maria intervened gently. I can get him a coffee, she offered, hoping to de-escalate the situation. It's not busy. 1 cup isn't going to kill our bottom line tonight. Steve turned on her, jaw clenched. Maria, we don't give out freebies. If he doesn't have money, show him the door. A spark of defiance ignited in Maria's chest. Something about the old man's demeanor, his quiet dignity, made her want to stand up for him. She turned to the man and asked, Do you have any money at all? He shook his head slowly, an apology in his eyes. Steve crossed his arms. You have 5 seconds to move along. The old man struggled to stand, leaning on the edge of the table. He winced, as though in pain. Maria couldn't take it anymore. I'll pay for his coffee, she declared, slapping a few crumpled bills from her tip jar onto the table. No more excuses now. He's a paying customer. Steve glared, clearly furious at being undermined in front of the staff. But he couldn't argue with the money on the table, so he spun around and stormed off without another word. The old man slowly lowered himself back into the booth and offered Maria a grateful, crooked smile. She grabbed a clean mug, poured fresh coffee, and brought it to him. Here, she said softly. Drink up. He wrapped his trembling hands around the cup, inhaling the warmth. Maria realized just how fragile he was. He could have been someone's grandpa. The lines etched in his face were deep, like he'd been through more hardship than one person should bear. Yet there was a steadiness in his eyes that took her by surprise. "Thank you," he said simply. She noticed how he spoke, carefully choosing his words. His voice was soft but carried a resonance that made her wonder what he used to do before he ended up like this. Maria decided not to pry. She figured he must have a story, but she'd let him share it on his own terms. Instead, she introduced herself. "I'm Maria, and I'm sorry about all that." He nodded, lips curling slightly. Let's just say I'm Ethan." She repeated his name, noticing how he paused, almost as if he was selecting it from a hidden shelf of identities. This was Ethan, but was that really his name? Minutes later, 2 regular customers came in. One was a night shift nurse, exhausted from a 12-hour shift, and the other was a truck driver grabbing a quick bite before hitting the road. Neither took much notice of Ethan in the corner, but Steve, pacing behind the counter, kept shooting daggers his way. Maria tried to carry on as normal, refilling salt shakers, wiping tables, and giving the new customers menus. But she felt unsettled. Something told her that Ethan wasn't just any homeless man. There was a tension in the air, almost like he was observing everything with the scrutiny of an inspector. Yet at the same time, it could simply be her imagination running wild because she was exhausted. She glanced at Steve again. He was rubbing his temples, clearly irritated. He loomed near the register as though waiting to pounce on any excuse to make Ethan leave. Maria feared a confrontation was brewing, one that could end badly if Steve's temper got the best of him. She decided to check on Ethan. Approaching the booth, she saw that his coffee was nearly gone. "Need a refill?" she asked. He looked at her with eyes that held an ocean of weariness. "Yes, please," he whispered. As she poured him another cup, he said something that took her by surprise. "Did you always dream of working in a diner?" he asked gently, a curious glint in his gaze. Maria felt her cheeks warm. She shrugged, placing the coffee pot on the table. "Well, it's honest work, but no, I didn't. I'm actually trying to save up to attend culinary school. I want to start my own bakery one day." Ethan listened intently, a faint smile on his lips. "Good ambition," he said, tapping his fingers on the table. "You have a good heart." His words made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite explain. They felt less like a compliment and more like an evaluation, as if he was silently measuring her against some unknown standard. Before she could ask him more, Steve's voice cut through the air once again. "Maria, orders up for table 2, he hollered. Maria rushed back to the kitchen to grab the food, her mind spinning. Something about the way Ethan spoke gave her goosebumps. He seemed too articulate, too self-possessed for someone who'd been living on the streets. But she didn't want to judge. Life could turn on a dime. Maybe he was once a college professor or a writer who'd lost everything. Or maybe he was just a particularly eloquent guy. She still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. As she delivered the order to the nurse and the truck driver, she overheard Steve muttering to one of the other waitresses. "We'll see how long this Ethan lasts. I'm not running a charity here." The waitress responded with a non-committal shrug, clearly not wanting to provoke Steve. Maria wanted to tell him to stop being such a jerk, but she knew that if she did, she'd have a target on her back the size of the diner sign outside. Ethan sipped his coffee quietly, occasionally glancing at the nurse and truck driver, who chatted about the traffic and the cold weather. He seemed to be taking in everything, from the flickering overhead lights to the greasy spatula the cook was using behind the counter. Eventually, the time came for Maria to clock out again, truly, this time. She couldn't justify staying longer without pay, especially with rent looming. But as she wiped her hands and untied her apron, she saw Ethan struggling to his feet once more, wincing in pain, likely from sleeping rough on the streets. A wave of concern washed over her, and she approached him gently. "You okay?" she asked, resisting the urge to reach out and steady him. "I'll manage," he said, but his voice was strained. It pained Maria to see him like that. She glanced at Steve's scowling face. There was no way he would let Ethan hang around all night without paying for more food. She made a quick decision. "How about a slice of pie on me?" she offered, her voice quiet. "It'll keep you going a little longer." Ethan hesitated. "I don't want to trouble you." She shook her head. "You're not a trouble. I just want to help." The corners of his mouth lifted in a grateful smile that looked both genuine and oddly proud. Maria slipped into the kitchen and grabbed a slice of apple pie. The cook gave her a curious glance but didn't say anything. She found a paper bag and tucked the pie inside. Then she handed it to Ethan as he waited near the front door. He thanked her softly, his eyes shimmering under the harsh fluorescent lights. Maria felt an overwhelming urge to make sure he was safe, but she knew she couldn't do much more than what she'd already done. Her shift was over, and Steve would likely blow a gasket if she kept giving away food. She walked Ethan to the door, her heart heavy. "Be careful out there," she whispered. He nodded, stepping out into the cold. But before he left, he turned back and said, "You deserve better than this place." Maria blinked, unsure of what he meant. Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the night. Confused and touched at once, she stood there for a moment longer, watching as his figure faded into the empty street. Then Steve barked her name again, and she hurried to clock out, her mind buzzing with questions. Maria tossed and turned that night, replaying the events in her head. She hated how Steve treated people. The guy was power-hungry, and seemed to enjoy lording it over anyone he perceived as weaker. She also couldn't shake the strange sense that Ethan was someone important, like he carried a secret that he was almost amused to keep hidden. But her exhaustion eventually swallowed her curiosity, and she drifted off into a fitful sleep, dreaming of half-formed scenes in which the diner's neon sign flickered ominously over a figure she couldn't quite see. The next morning, she woke up extra early, determined to beat the usual rush. She thought about calling in sick just to avoid Steve, but she needed the money. She arrived at the diner to see that the windows were fogged up against the brisk morning air. As she stepped inside, the warmth was a welcome relief, but the tension in the air was already thick. There were rumors flying around among the staff. "Apparently the old homeless guy showed up again," whispered one of the waitresses, glancing over her shoulder. "Steve's on the warpath." Maria felt her heart jolt. She hurried to the back to stow her jacket, then quickly tied on her apron. Before she even made it to the front of the diner, Steve was in her face. "Your pal's back," he snarled. "He thinks he can just stroll in here and hang around. I won't have it." Maria peered over his shoulder and saw Ethan sitting at the same corner booth, hands folded on the table, as if waiting. Waiting for what? That was the second red flag. Why keep coming back to a place where you'd been treated so poorly? She swallowed her nerves and approached him. "You're here early," she said, trying to keep her voice light. He nodded. "I found a spot to rest for the night," he explained quietly. "Thought I'd come in and see if I could get a coffee. Of course, I'll pay. Well, I'll figure something out." Maria's eyes darted to Steve, who was hovering. She offered Ethan a small, sympathetic smile. "Can you give me a second?" She hurried to the register, where Steve stood with arms crossed. She pleaded softly. "He's not doing any harm. If he buys something, then it's fine, right?" Steve rolled his eyes. "He doesn't have money, Maria. What's he going to pay with, buttons?" Just then, another regular, a retired teacher named Linda, walked in and recognized Ethan from the day before. She'd seen Maria offer him coffee and a slice of pie. Without a word, Linda stepped forward and handed Maria a $5 bill. "For his coffee," she said with a kind smile, then turned to find her own seat. Steve glared at Linda but couldn't say anything. Money was money, even if it came from a different customer. Maria felt a small triumph in her chest as she took the $5 bill and started preparing Ethan's coffee. But she also felt uneasy. Why did Ethan keep coming back? The curiosity gnawed at her. When she brought him the steaming mug, she couldn't help but ask, "So Ethan, is there a reason you're here again so soon?" He took a slow sip, and for a moment she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he gazed at her with a calm intensity. Just observing, he said. Getting a sense of how things run here. His eyes flicked to Steve, who was now seated at a booth near the door, flipping through receipts with a scowl. Maria felt a chill. Observing what, exactly? She asked carefully. He shrugged, an enigmatic smile creeping across his face. Everything. The staff, the environment, the way people treat each other. Particularly those who appear to have the least power. The way he emphasized those last words made Maria's pulse quicken. She could sense there was something bigger at play, but she couldn't guess what. Well, you picked a tough place to do that, she murmured, casting a nervous glance towards Steve. Ethan only nodded, sipping his coffee again. Linda waved Maria over to take her order, and as Maria walked away, she couldn't shake the growing suspicion that Ethan was not who he seemed. It wasn't just his articulate speech or his measured demeanor, it was the subtle command he had over the room, despite looking like a homeless man. Even Steve, for all his bluster, seemed a little uneasy around him, like he was trying extra hard to assert dominance. Maybe Ethan's presence reminded Steve of something, or someone, he didn't want to remember. As Maria took Linda's order, a short stack of pancakes and some scrambled eggs, Linda mentioned softly. Saw that gentleman outside earlier. Looked like he was on the phone. Maria nearly dropped her pen. On the phone? Are you sure? Linda nodded. He was behind the building, talking low, but he definitely had a phone in his hand. I only caught a glimpse. The revelation shook Maria. How could Ethan be homeless yet have a phone? She thought back to his battered clothing, the lines on his face, and the slight limp. But a phone could mean he had resources, or connections. Most people in his situation didn't. Was he a scammer? Or was he telling the truth when he said he was just observing? Maria's mind whirled with possibilities. She finished taking Linda's order and rushed the slip to the cook. When she passed by Ethan's table again, she studied him more closely. His coat was tattered, but underneath, she spotted a hint of a nicer shirt, something that didn't quite fit the rest of his attire. It was like he'd layered himself with mismatched clothes. She wondered if he'd done that deliberately. Steve, watching from across the diner, called out, Maria, if you're done gawking, we've got orders to fill. She bristled but forced herself to ignore his rudeness. She filled coffee cups, delivered Linda's food, and tried not to let her thoughts spiral. Yet, she couldn't help imagining all sorts of scenarios. Maybe Ethan was an undercover cop investigating something. Or maybe he was a private detective. The possibility that he might be someone with real authority kept nagging at her. Then again, she reminded herself, sometimes people just fall on hard times. Maybe she was overthinking it. But as she saw Ethan glance at Steve once more, a guarded look crossing his face, she suspected she wasn't imagining it at all. Later that same day, the lunch crowd trickled in, forcing Maria to put her curiosity aside and focus on orders. Burgers sizzled on the grill, and the smell of fries filled the air. Ethan remained in his corner, quietly sipping coffee, one cup that Linda had paid for. Maria worried that Steve might try to chase him out again, but he was seemingly too busy dealing with the lunch rush. The place wasn't as packed as it could be, given the diner's prime location. A lot of regulars had stopped coming after seeing how Steve ran things. He'd earned a reputation for cutting corners, rationing condiments, and snapping at customers who asked for substitutions. As Maria bustled about, she caught glimpses of Ethan taking in every detail, from the rickety chairs to the chipped paint on the walls. He didn't just look like a passive observer, he looked like someone with a stake in what was happening, someone deciding how to fix or change it. At one point, a coworker named Alice nudged Maria while they were grabbing silverware from a storage closet. Why is he staring at everyone like that? It's creepy, Alice whispered. I don't know, Maria admitted. He's polite though. And he's done nothing wrong. Alice shrugged. Maybe he's not homeless at all. Maybe he's some kind of corporate spy or something. Maria managed a half laugh. But deep inside she wondered if Alice might be closer to the truth than she realized. By early afternoon, Ethan stood, folded his arms, and seemed to be deciding something. He caught Maria's eye and motioned for her to come over. She excused herself from restocking napkins and approached him. In a low voice, he said, "Thank you for the coffee. I need to step out for a while, but I might be back." Maria bit her lip, curiosity burning in her chest. "Are you meeting someone?" He gave her a cryptic smile. "I've got a few things to handle. And I've got to check on some resources." The way he said resources made Maria's mind race with more questions. But before she could probe further, he added, "If anyone asks about me, just tell them I'll be around." Then he slipped out the door as quietly as he'd arrived, leaving Maria with a storm of thoughts she couldn't quell. Steve, noticing Ethan leaving, marched over. "Finally got rid of him?" he asked, sounding almost triumphant. "He's coming back," Maria said. "At least, that's what he said." Steve's nostrils flared. "Like hell he is," he spat. He pointed a finger in Maria's face. "Listen, if that guy comes around again without money, he's gone, you hear me? I don't care who sponsors his coffee next time." She felt a surge of defiance. "He's not hurting anyone," she muttered under her breath, but Steve heard her. He leaned in closer, his voice a menacing whisper. "I run this place. My word is law. I don't need some vagrant hanging around, making us look bad. Got it?" Maria swallowed her anger, forced a tight nod, and turned back to work. But her heart pounded in her chest. She was getting sick of Steve's cruelty, the way he acted like customers and staff were disposable. If Ethan truly was someone important, and Maria was starting to believe he was, then Steve might be in for a rude awakening someday. Days passed. Ethan popped in sporadically, usually sitting in the same booth, ordering minimal items, often sponsored by kind-hearted regulars who took pity on him. He never asked for it, but people offered. He was polite, well-spoken, and always observing. Maria noticed that every time he left, he walked out with more confidence than when he entered, as though he was gradually shedding the homeless persona he had initially displayed. Each time, Steve fumed, threatening to bar him permanently, but something always intervened: a paying customer, a timely phone call, or a small wave of sympathy from other employees. By now, the staff had begun speculating wildly about Ethan's real story. Some believed he was a veteran with a pension problem. Others thought he might be a grifter. Maria, however, kept her own counsel. Something in her gut said Ethan was here for a reason. Then one morning, everything changed. The diner was busier than usual for a Tuesday. A large group of tourists had come in from a tour bus that broke down nearby. They were all noisy, snapping pictures, pointing at the retro decor. Maria and Alice rushed around, taking orders, refilling water, delivering plates stacked with pancakes and eggs. The manager, Steve, seemed oddly nervous despite the influx of business. He was usually all about maximizing profits, but today he looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Maria couldn't figure out why until she saw Ethan walk in. He was dressed similarly to before, layered clothes, battered sneakers, but he moved with even greater confidence. This time, he had a small notepad in his hand. Maria noticed him scribbling something as he walked to his usual booth. Something about his demeanor made her pulse quicken. It was as though a countdown had started, and something big was about to happen. Steve practically threw down the dish he was holding and stormed over to Ethan's booth. "All right, that's it," he growled, loud enough for the nearby tourists to hear. A few of them paused mid-bite, turning to watch. "I've had enough of you lurking around, taking notes, scaring off customers." The irony wasn't lost on Maria. There was a full house, and Ethan wasn't scaring off anyone. But that didn't matter to Steve, who was clearly unraveling. Ethan calmly placed his notepad face down on the table. "I'm not scaring anyone," he replied in an even tone. "But I do have business here." Steve snorted. "Business? You're homeless. The only business you have is begging for scraps." A hush fell around the nearby tables, and Maria felt her jaw clench at Steve's cruelty. Ethan pressed his lips together, as if trying to hold back a flash of anger or perhaps disappointment. "I'm sorry you think that," he said, "but your assumption is incorrect. A few of the braver tourists began to whip out their phones, sensing a juicy confrontation. Steve noticed and flashed a tight, fake smile for the cameras. Then he turned his wrath back on Ethan. "Get out of my diner!" he demanded. "Right now!" But Ethan didn't move. Maria's heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. Part of her wanted to intervene, but she also felt that something monumental was about to unfold. Ethan lifted his gaze, and for the first time, there was a clear, commanding presence in his eyes, one that reminded Maria of top executives she'd glimpsed on TV. "I'll leave when I'm ready," he said quietly. "Because, for the record, this diner isn't yours." The air froze. Steve sputtered. "What did you just say to me?" Ethan let out a weary sigh, as though this confrontation was overdue. "You heard me. It's not yours, and it never should have been." Murmurs rippled through the diner. The tourists edged closer, not wanting to miss a single word. Maria felt her breath catch. Was this it? Was Ethan about to reveal who he really was? Steve leaned in, his face contorted with rage. "Look, old man, I don't know what scam you're pulling, but this is my establishment. I'm the manager. I make the rules." Ethan shook his head, an almost sorrowful expression crossing his features. Then he said, in a voice that reverberated with authority, "You're just the manager. I'm the one who built this place. I'm the CEO who went missing years ago. I'm Ethan Carter." A collective gasp went up from the crowd, including the staff. Plates clattered, and a tourist actually dropped his fork onto the floor. Maria felt her knees weaken, the name echoing in her mind. Ethan Carter. She'd heard rumors of the founder of this diner chain disappearing under strange circumstances. Nobody ever found out what happened. And here he was, standing in front of her, in tattered clothes, claiming to be that very man. Steve's face paled, but he tried to laugh it off. "You're insane," he barked, though his voice wavered. "You expect me to believe you're Ethan Carter? The man's been gone for years, probably dead." Ethan calmly reached into his pocket, pulling out what looked like a worn, engraved key. "Do you recognize this?" he asked, holding it out. Maria squinted, trying to see the design. Steve took a step back, shock flickering in his eyes. He recognized it, that much was clear. Everyone seemed to hold their breath as Ethan continued. "This is the master key to every single diner in the Carter chain. Only one exists, and it was entrusted to me when I built the company. I had it engraved with the date we opened our first location." Maria caught sight of a date on the key, 2 decades ago. She realized that was before she was even born. Steve attempted a sneer, but it came out shaky. "You probably stole that from somewhere. Doesn't prove you're who you say you are." Ethan gave a humorless laugh. "I expected you'd say that. Lucky for me, I've got more than just a key. I have documents, accounts, and a timeline that shows exactly where I've been and why I was gone. But we'll get to that in time." By now, people in the diner were standing, forming a ring around the booth like spectators at a boxing match. Phones were recording. Steve's gaze darted around, seeing that he was being filmed, and he tried to salvage some control. "Even if, hypothetically, you are Ethan Carter, you abandoned this company. You vanished. That means you forfeited all rights, and I took over. I'm the reason this diner is still standing." Ethan's face hardened. "You're the reason it's failing," he countered, voice rising enough to carry through the diner. "Look at the state it's in. Staff turnover is high, the place is half empty most of the time, and the few loyal customers you have are disrespected. You're running it into the ground, just as I feared." Maria's eyes darted between the two men, heart pounding. She couldn't believe what she was witnessing. The homeless man she'd shown kindness to was actually the elusive CEO, returning to see what had become of his business. The tension was palpable. Ethan leaned forward, locking eyes with Steve. "You and my brother conspired to remove me from the company while I was hospitalized years ago. I lost everything while I recovered. Once I was well enough, I tried to return, but I discovered the finances had been manipulated to edge me out. I've been biding my time, gathering evidence. And now, He glanced at the crowd. Now is the moment to expose what's been happening behind my back. Steve looked around, wildly searching for a lifeline, but the phones aimed at him only recorded his every move. He had no allies in that room. The staff, especially Maria, stood rooted in place, too stunned to speak. Maria felt a rush of something close to relief. Maybe this was the universe correcting a great wrong. Steve tried one last tactic. If you really are Ethan Carter, then prove it, right now, with something undeniable. Ethan reached into his pocket again and pulled out a folded, yellowed letter. This is a notarized letter from the attorney who handled my affairs when I was hospitalized. It's addressed to me, Ethan James Carter, and it lays out the terms of my ownership and how it could only be transferred if I sold the majority shares, which I never did. The crowd murmured. Steve gulped, his bravado shrinking by the second. This is some trick, he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Ethan locked eyes with Maria, as if silently acknowledging her kindness. Then he turned to Steve. I've seen firsthand how you treat employees. How you treat the vulnerable who walk into this place. And I'm done letting you tarnish the reputation of what I built. In that moment, Maria felt a surge of vindication. All those times she'd been bullied, all the times Steve had belittled her, replayed in her mind. She couldn't hold back any longer. He's telling the truth, she declared, stepping forward. He's been watching how you run this place, Steve. And I've seen how you treat people. It's not right. Steve shot her a look of pure venom, but the crowd murmured in agreement. Linda, the retired teacher, chimed in. We support Ethan. A tense silence followed before Steve suddenly snapped. Get out, all of you! He roared, eyes wild. He snatched the letter from Ethan's hand, trying to tear it, but Ethan reacted swiftly, grabbing it back before it was destroyed. In the chaos, one of the tourists called out, I'm posting this on social media. The world deserves to see how you treat the real owner. Steve, sweating profusely, lunged toward the phone. But the tourist jerked back, capturing everything on video. Alice, the waitress, let out a small scream as she scrambled away from the confrontation. It was a scene of pure pandemonium. The cook rushed out of the kitchen, spatula in hand, wanting to see what the shouting was about. The rest of the staff stood in shock or tried to calm the customers who were either frightened or enthralled by the live drama. Ethan, refusing to back down, stared Steve down like he was the king retaking his castle. This is over, he said, his voice strong. You and your cronies did everything you could to shut me out, but I'm back now. And I have the right, legally and morally, to reclaim what's mine. At that moment, the diner door swung open with a jingle of the bell, and 2 police officers stepped in, alerted by the ruckus. They took in the chaotic scene, phones in the air, Steve looking furious, Ethan clutching papers and a key, Maria standing protectively nearby. One officer held up a hand. We got calls about a disturbance. Everybody calm down. Steve, desperate, pointed at Ethan. He's trespassing, officer. I want him out of here. The crowd erupted with protest. No, no! He owns this place! Multiple voices shouted. Ethan took a deep breath, handing over his documents to the officer. Sir, I have proof that I am Ethan James Carter, original owner of this establishment. I'd like you to review these. The officer flipped through them, eyebrows rising. If this is legit, it looks like he's got a claim, he murmured. Steve tried to babble something about forgeries, but the officer ignored him. The second officer recognized the name. Wait a minute, Ethan Carter? I remember hearing about your disappearance years back. Didn't the news say you vanished under suspicious circumstances? Ethan nodded grimly. I did. And I intend to press charges once I've finalized my case against those who conspired to keep me out. Steve looked like a cornered animal. This is ridiculous. He sputtered, but his face told another story. The officer, seeing the tension, asked Ethan calmly, So, you're the rightful owner, and you want him. He pointed to Steve. Out of this place? Ethan hesitated. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Then he spoke. I don't want any violence, but yes, I want him removed. I want him barred from making decisions here. The staff can back me up on how he's been running this place into the ground." Maria felt relief coursing through her veins. She nodded vigorously, as did Alice. Several customers chimed in with their complaints about Steve's rude behavior. The officer turned to Steve. "Sir, I think it's best you come with us and sort this out downtown. We can confirm the documents and ownership once we have your statements." Steve tried to protest, but when he realized the entire diner was against him, that the evidence was stacked in Ethan's favor, he had no choice. He stormed out, escorted by the two officers, hurling curses over his shoulder. The camera phones captured every moment. Once the door slammed shut behind them, a stunned hush fell over the diner. Then, unexpectedly, a cheer erupted from the staff and the remaining customers. Linda clapped her hands, tears in her eyes, while a few of the tourists whistled. Maria let out a shaky breath she hadn't known she was holding. Ethan stood there, looking almost overwhelmed by the surge of emotion. He carefully tucked the documents and key back into his pocket. The adrenaline in the room was palpable, like the aftermath of a storm that leaves everyone rattled but oddly exhilarated. Maria approached him slowly. "Is it really you?" she asked quietly, still half in disbelief. He nodded, his eyes reflecting both relief and sadness. "It is," he replied. "And I'm sorry for all the trouble this caused." She shook her head. "I'm just shocked. But also relieved. Steve was—" She couldn't find the words to describe the torment Steve had put her and others through. Ethan gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You were kind to me when you had no idea who I was. That won't be forgotten." In the days that followed, the diner was abuzz with gossip and excitement. People came just to see the long-lost CEO, who had returned. Social media videos of the confrontation went viral, showing how a homeless-looking man had walked in and demanded his diner back. The footage of Steve's meltdown and subsequent escort by police spread like wildfire, turning Ethan into a local legend overnight. But all the attention didn't derail the more important tasks at hand. Ethan worked tirelessly to prove his legal rights, to reclaim his official standing in the company, and to ensure the staff got the support they needed. It wasn't an instant fix. There were meetings with lawyers, calls to old contacts, mountains of paperwork to sign. But the difference in morale was immediate. Without Steve's oppressive presence, the diner felt open, almost celebratory. Customers who had stayed away started trickling back. And for Maria, everything changed. It started the morning after Steve's removal. Ethan called an impromptu staff gathering before opening. He stood at the front, in fresh clothes, still simple, but clean and better fitted. Gone were the battered sneakers, replaced by sturdy, sensible shoes. His hair was trimmed, and though he still bore the lines of someone who had seen hard times, he now looked every bit the professional CEO. The staff gaped at him, unable to reconcile this polished figure with the weary homeless man they'd known. Maria noticed that same quiet strength in his eyes, but now it radiated with renewed confidence. "I want to thank you all for not just tolerating me," he began, scanning the small group of employees, "but for showing me what was really going on here. Over the last few weeks, I've seen firsthand the dedication you put into your work despite terrible management." He paused, letting the words sink in. Alice, standing beside Maria, dabbed tears from her eyes, remembering the many humiliations under Steve. "Things will change now," Ethan promised. "I can't fix everything overnight, but I intend to restore this diner, and every diner in our chain, to the standard it once had." A few of the cooks and servers exchanged hopeful looks. Maria's heart fluttered with anticipation. Then Ethan focused on Maria specifically. "Maria," he said, "you were the only one who went out of your way to help me, even when it could have cost you. You gave me coffee, a slice of pie, and your kindness. You risked Steve's wrath to treat me like a human being. And that means more than I can say." Heat rose to her cheeks. She felt the eyes of the room on her, and for once, she didn't mind. "I just did what anyone should do," she mumbled, her voice trembling. Ethan shook his head. Not everyone does. That's why it stands out. He opened a folder he'd been carrying. I've looked into the records, and I can see we're short-staffed and lacking proper leadership. Starting today, I'd like to promote you. Maria's eyes widened. Promote her? She looked around, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Ethan continued. You have the heart and the drive to manage this place better than Steve ever did. You told me once you wanted to go to culinary school, to open your own bakery. Well, we can work something out that helps you develop those skills while running this diner's operations. If you're willing, of course. A hush fell over the room. Alice nudged Maria excitedly, and a few of the cooks smiled. Tears pricked at the corners of Maria's eyes. She could barely process the offer. I don't know what to say, she stammered, overwhelmed. Ethan smiled gently. Say yes, he suggested. Maria nodded, a grin breaking out on her face as the rest of the staff erupted in applause. She felt a mix of elation and disbelief. A new future was opening up before her eyes, one where she wouldn't be stuck under Steve's oppressive rule, one where she might actually pursue her dream of going to culinary school and eventually opening her own bakery. And it was all because she had taken the time to show compassion to a weary, ragged man who'd turned out to be the CEO. After the impromptu meeting, Ethan took Maria aside for a moment of quiet. He looked around the diner, as though seeing it through fresh eyes. We'll need a new coat of paint, some upgraded equipment, and definitely a better pay structure for everyone, he mused. But the soul of this place, the people who actually care, that's already strong. Maria nodded, following his gaze across the worn booths and faded menus. We always wanted it to be better, she said softly. But no one would listen. Ethan turned to her, a resolute look on his face. I'm listening now. Within a week, the changes were visible. Workers came in to fix the lighting and scrub off years of grime that had accumulated under Steve's neglect. Some employees were granted immediate raises, and Ethan started them on a new training program designed to improve customer service and workplace satisfaction. Morale soared. Customers noticed a difference in the atmosphere. Everyone was friendlier, the place looked cleaner, and the menu even got a few upgrades. Alice, once timid, began greeting customers with confidence. The cook, who had barely spoken, now offered suggestions on how to improve dishes. And Maria, in her new managerial role, found herself working closely with Ethan to keep the place running smoothly and ethically. Papers were signed, legal matters progressed, and official announcements were made confirming Ethan Carter's return as CEO of the Carter Diner chain. Board members scrambled, especially those who had benefited from his absence. Some tried to discredit him, but Ethan's evidence was rock solid. The story gained traction in local media, and soon a wave of public support poured in for this once-lost CEO who'd gone undercover to see the truth behind his business. And with each passing day, Ethan grew more comfortable in his role again. He confessed to Maria one afternoon, while examining the old registers, that he'd been fearful of how he'd be received. I left under terrible circumstances, he said. I worried people wouldn't believe me, or that the place had moved on without me. Maria squeezed his arm reassuringly. We needed you, she said simply. Even if we didn't know it was you. One day, out of the blue, Steve showed up. He walked in with an air of defiance, but also desperation. He had a thick folder tucked under his arm and demanded to see Ethan. Maria intercepted him in the lobby, crossing her arms. What are you doing here? She asked tersely. Gone was the frightened waitress of before. She stood with authority now. Steve grimaced. I have a right to be here. I used to run this place. Maria shook her head. Not anymore. Before she could summon security, yes, Ethan had hired a security guard just to prevent outbursts like this. Ethan stepped into view. The tension was electric. Customers who recognized Steve began whispering nervously. I came to negotiate, Steve said stiffly, holding out the folder. I have documents too, you know. Ethan's face was unreadable. I'm open to hearing what you have to say, he replied calmly. Steve gritted his teeth, glancing around at the pristine diner he once terrorized. "I want a payout," he said bluntly. "I gave years of my life to this place. I deserve something." A hush fell. Maria almost laughed at the absurdity. Steve, who had tormented everyone and run the business into the ground, now wanted compensation. Ethan studied him for a long moment, then responded, "If you have any legitimate claim, bring it through the proper channels. I'll have my legal team review it." Steve's anger simmered beneath the surface. "You think you can just toss me aside?" he spat. "I kept this diner afloat while you were off who knows where." At that, Ethan's composure faltered for the first time. "You call this afloat?" he said quietly, gesturing at the newly renovated interior. "I see a place that was neglected, staff that was abused, and customers who were driven away." He shook his head. "You'll get what's legally owed to you, nothing more." Steve's face turned red. He shoved the folder into Ethan's hands. "Fine. But don't think this is over." Before he could storm out, Ethan said one last thing. "Remember, Steve, people saw how you treated me when I looked homeless. That alone speaks volumes." Steve glared, then stalked out without another word. Maria let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She glanced at Ethan, who was already skimming the contents of the folder. "Nothing but empty threats," he murmured, then set it aside. Despite the drama, it felt good to see that Ethan handled it with fairness and firmness. A far cry from how Steve had bullied everyone. Maria realized that, under Ethan's leadership, the diner was truly on a path to become something better. A month later, the diner was almost unrecognizable. Fresh paint graced the walls, new light fixtures made everything brighter, and the staff was genuinely happy. Profits had already begun to climb as word spread that the Carter Diner was back. On the surface, it might have looked like just a typical local eatery turning things around, but to those who had witnessed the reveal, it was a symbol of justice being restored. People came from all over, hoping to catch a glimpse of the CEO who'd pretended to be homeless and had recaptured his throne with quiet determination. Maria, now effectively managing day-to-day operations, often found herself pinching her own arm just to make sure she wasn't dreaming. The memory of that night, the first time she offered Ethan a free coffee, played in her mind like a movie scene. Sometimes he'd joke, "You know, that was the best coffee of my life." And they'd share a laugh about how everything changed in that single act of kindness. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Ethan still had legal battles to fight against those who had conspired to keep him out of his own company, and he had to work hard to earn the trust of some board members who weren't thrilled about his unorthodox comeback. Yet, every time he walked into that diner, the staff greeted him with genuine smiles, and the customers, loyal or new, would nod in respect. It was a simple place, but it had become the heart of his journey. One late evening, after closing, Maria was tallying up receipts when Ethan came in to check on her. He was dressed in casual clothes now, a sign that he was more comfortable in this new routine. "Everything good?" he asked softly. She nodded, yawning. "Just finishing up. We had a good day," she reported, pointing at the receipts that showed their sales were up again. Ethan took a seat at the counter. "I can't thank you enough for sticking by me, even when you didn't know who I was." She smiled wistfully. "I just did what felt right. I didn't do it expecting a reward." He gave her a warm look. "That's exactly why you deserved one." He reached into a small bag he'd brought in and pulled out a thick binder. "I've been meaning to show you something," he said, sliding it over to her. Curiosity piqued, Maria opened the binder to find brochures and information about culinary schools, along with a detailed cost breakdown and potential scholarship options. Her heart skipped a beat. She started, then realized her eyes were welling up. "You didn't have to." He raised a hand, silencing her gently. "You told me your dream was to go to culinary school and open your own bakery. I want to help. I'm setting aside a fund for employees who want to further their education or improve their skills. You'd be one of the first recipients if you want it." Maria stared at the pages, a sense of joy washing over her. For years, that dream had felt like a distant star, impossible to reach. Now, thanks to her compassion for a stranger who turned out to be a CEO, the dream was suddenly within grasp. She threw her arms around him, hugging him tight. He patted her shoulder, a touch fatherly, before pulling away. "You'll still have to do the studying and pass the exams," he teased. She laughed through tears. "Deal." The next morning, Maria stepped into the diner with a renewed sense of purpose. She greeted Alice, who was already prepping coffee filters. They exchanged cheerful banter about the day's specials. The walls, once chipped and dull, now sported a bright coat of paint that made the entire place seem alive. The brand-new sign outside, "Carter's Diner," gleamed in the morning sun, a testament to how far they'd come. As the day wore on, customers filtered in, some new, some old. Each table buzzed with conversation, the clink of utensils, and the comforting aroma of hot food. The staff moved with confidence, no longer worried about being berated or belittled. Ethan arrived around noon, wearing a light jacket and a smile that suggested he was proud of what they were building together. He took time to chat with each employee, praising their work and asking for suggestions on how to improve further. Maria couldn't help but grin as she watched him. He truly cared, and that set the tone for everyone else. A businessman in a sleek suit came up to the counter, tapping on his phone. He looked up to see Ethan wiping a table. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you Ethan Carter?" Ethan, caught off guard, paused. "Yes, I am," he replied. The businessman offered a hand. "I run a restaurant consulting firm, and I've been hearing about what you did, going undercover as a homeless man to see how your own business was being run. That's remarkable." Ethan shrugged modestly. "I just needed to see the truth." The businessman handed him a card. "If you ever want to collaborate on expansions or new ventures, let me know. We could do something amazing together." Ethan studied the card thoughtfully, then nodded. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. Maria, listening from behind the counter, felt a spark of excitement. This diner was just the beginning. With Ethan's return, who knew where things might go? She saw him glance in her direction with a smile, and a wave of gratitude washed over her again. She'd witnessed the worst of people in Steve, but also the best in Ethan, and even in herself, for taking a risk by helping him. By mid-afternoon, the diner was comfortably busy. The shift passed in a blur of activity, taking orders, refilling drinks, enjoying the lively chatter. Near closing time, Ethan gathered the staff around again, just like he had done before. "I have a quick announcement," he said, looking at the employees. "We're doing well, better than expected. So as of next paycheck, everyone is getting a slight pay increase. It's a step in the right direction." Applause and cheers followed. Alice looked like she might faint from happiness. The cook shouted, "Hallelujah!" from the kitchen. Maria couldn't stop smiling. At last, the stress and gloom that had blanketed the place under Steve's management were lifted. As people dispersed to clean up for the night, Ethan pulled Maria aside one more time. "There's something else," he said quietly. Her eyebrows rose. "You're full of surprises," she teased. He chuckled. "It's not that big. I just wanted you to have this." He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a gift certificate to a local store that sold high-quality chef's knives. She looked up at him, speechless. "For your future bakery," he explained. "Figured you'd want your own tools." In that instant, Maria realized how much her life had changed since the night she offered Ethan a cup of coffee. She felt a swell of emotion, gratitude, hope, excitement. She remembered the cold, quiet corner booth where he'd sat, shivering, trying to look smaller than he was. She remembered the spark in his eye the moment he realized she wasn't going to turn him away. And now here they were, a once-lost CEO, redeemed by his return, and a waitress-turned-manager who was finally on the path to her dreams. She held the certificate close, blinking back tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Ethan waved it off. "Just keep being you," he said, as though it was the simplest thing in the world. It all came full circle one evening when a newcomer walked in, ragged and worn, obviously in need of kindness. Maria didn't hesitate. She walked over, offered a warm smile, and asked if he needed something to eat or drink. The stranger, taken aback by her generosity, stammered that he was down on his luck. But she, remembering all that had happened, simply grabbed a menu and told him to pick whatever he wanted. Across the room, Ethan watched with a nod of approval. No one reprimanded her, no one barked at her about lost profits. Instead, the staff moved in harmony, ensuring that the stranger felt welcome. And that, perhaps more than anything else, was the ultimate sign of transformation. The diner had become a place of compassion, a place where good hearts thrived. As Maria rang up a late customer's bill, she caught her reflection in the diner's window. She hardly recognized the confident woman staring back. The memory of her old self, too timid to confront Steve, felt like a different lifetime. And standing behind her, reflected in the glass, was Ethan, the CEO who'd arrived in disguise, changed her life, and restored a legacy. When she turned to meet his gaze, he gave her a slight nod, as if to say, "Well done." A final wave of relief and happiness enveloped Maria. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges. There would always be hurdles to overcome, business decisions to navigate, personal ambitions to fulfill. But she had found her place and her purpose, all thanks to a single act of kindness on a cold night. Ethan had shown her that underneath the layers of hardship and deception, there can be dignity, compassion, and second chances. And in turn, she'd helped him rediscover the heart of his business, the people who worked there and the customers who needed a welcoming place to eat a hot meal. She closed the register, switched off the neon, open, sign, and locked up for the night, feeling a sense of pride she'd never known before. Behind her, Ethan flipped a chair onto a table, preparing for the next day. They shared a smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new triumphs, and maybe even new faces who needed a helping hand. But this time, the diner stood ready, guided by empathy and restored by truth. And that, Maria thought as she gathered her things, was everything she ever wanted in a place she now happily called home.